Hi, everyone. Here we are, the final week of classes, and my mind goes to Y2K, something that some of you may have only heard of, were too young to remember. But the idea that when we clicked over from 1999 to 2000, there was a lot of fear about bank machines not working, or what if I can't get my gas I need for my car and junk like that. So let's go back a little bit to the year 1000. Imagine that amplified many times over. There was a lot of concern, anxiety in the years approaching the year 1000 that the world would end. And essentially, when it didn't, there was a sudden kind of compulsion to move. And what do I mean? I mean, people went on the move. So, as we saw already last week with the early Middle Ages, this idea that there was a kind of coherent medieval Europe is just belied by the facts that people, especially in the case of those years right after 1000, people were moving. So, how were they moving? Well, there was, of course, the Crusades. And the Crusades, which really stretched from Europe into the Middle Ages, into the Middle East, through the Mediterranean and on land, was initially focused on taking back, and notice in quotation marks, Jerusalem. So you'll recall from some weeks back, Islam established itself first by the Dome of the Rock, but then politically, Muslims were in charge of Jerusalem, something that Christians found not palatable. And so essentially, there were a series of these religious wars that sent Christians on the road. And again, made this notion of a kind of medieval Europe a much more permeable idea, a much more fluid idea. In any case, in addition to the Crusades, which were sometimes successful, sometimes not so much, people were also on the move for reasons of pilgrimage. So let's think about pilgrimage for just a minute. We have talked about pilgrimage in the context of Islam, in that one of the five pillars of Islam is that the faithful go to Mecca at least once in their lives. There is, of course, the tradition of pilgrimage in Buddhism. And pilgrimage is not confined for Christians to something in the distant Middle Ages. There are numbers of Christians that still will go on pilgrimage today. So, what is it? So, it is the notion that you take a journey, that might be a matter of weeks or even months. And you take this journey to be to have access and be close to the relics. Those are the remains of sacred people. Typically in Christian churches, we're talking about saints. Sometimes the sacred relics are, as we'll see, related to the Virgin Mary or Christ. In any case, after the year 1000, people really hit the road, and the church, in fact, encouraged it. And because the church saw it as a money making opportunity. And so, again, after the year 1000, you have people on the move, knights and soldiers going to Jerusalem in the name of Christianity. But you also have the faithful on the road to go and see and be near these sacred relics. So why would you go on pilgrimage? You might have done a really bad thing. Big old sin. Maybe you stole, maybe you, I don't know, murdered somebody. Your priest would tell you that you needed to go on pilgrimage. Maybe you're going on pilgrimage because you need something, like you have a sick child, or you yourself are facing some kind of illness. And certainly the relics were there and believed to be um, uh, able to perform miracles like healing. So, the big pilgrimage site that was kind of sponsored and promoted by the Christian church in this time after 1000 was in Spain, and it was the remains of St. James or Santiago. And to get there to Santiago de Compostela, there were a series of roads that were prescribed, and people heard about them by word of mouth, and you would head on out, for example, out of France along these prescribed routes. And on the way, you would stop at various churches that themselves had relics that you could go visit. So the one we're focusing on is that dedicated to Saint Sernin. In Latin, that would have been Saint Saturninus, in the city of Toulouse. So why am I bringing this to you? Because with this kind of rise of pilgrimage churches became a thing. And pilgrimage churches were built in something we are calling the Romanesque style. So the thing about pilgrimage churches is they get big, super big, to accommodate all these visitors who want to come see the remains, the relics of the saint. So the churches themselves, here's the front, are large. They have, as you can see, very solid, heavy walls, not a lot of windows. And this term Romanesque is because these churches are based on the Roman or rounded arch. And that is, as you can see here, in the two openings to the two doors to Saint Sernin, you see the use of the rounded arch. In the back, you see the use of the rounded arch around the windows themselves. In the back, that is the east end, is in fact where those relics would have been. And so when we see the plan of Saint Sernin, we see that the east end, so that's the apse, just to remind you, is full of all of these little bumps. And these little bumps, designated here by arrows, were little chapels within the interior of the church, and each little chapel would have had an altar, and each little altar would have had its own set of relics, maybe, kind of C-list saints, very regional, local saints. But anyway, the idea here is that you, as a visitor, as a pilgrim to this church, would get a lot of bang for your buck. You'd come in and you would walk the space around the entire East End, including the apse, and you would get to see all of these relics. So when we look at the interior of the structure, like the exterior, you're very much aware of this rounded arch, and now it's used in the ceiling. And the ceiling in these churches, these stone churches, are called vaults. So again, we have the rounded arch, and it's being used in the vault, the ceiling of the church. You can see it's lining the nave, because that's where we're standing. We're in the nave looking at the east end or the apse. And everywhere you look, there are these rounded arches. Here's a kind of detail. So here's the thing. When you are building a stone church and you're relying upon the rounded arch, you are looking at a lot of weight and a lot of force being exerted because of, physics. And so to make sure that that big, tall church with its rounded vaults was going to stand up, you had to, as this diagram indicates, come up with a way of moving the weight and the force from the very tall vault out to the side, out to the outer side, and down. And if this kind of rings a bell, we saw a similar notion or a similar kind of approach way back when we were looking at Hagia Sophia. So again, a Romanesque church like Saint Sernin is going to have heavy duty vertical supports that are called piers, and Romanesque churches have tiny little windows as indicated here. And so in this first part of the Middle Ages that kind of starts a little around the year 1000, and it's going to take us a couple of hundred years. Romanesque style was the architectural style of churches. So round arches, this very heavy duty vertical piers, and little teeny tiny windows. And here are just a couple of more examples of Romanesque style churches so you get the idea. There are teeny tiny windows there and very obvious use of rounded arches. Okay, so stay tuned because we're going to continue this discussion of architecture, but now we're going to see what happens after around the year 1190. Okay, that's it for now. Bye bye.